and welcome to the Mathematicians Podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we dig into the life, ideas, and mathematical contributions of Theaetetus, a figure whose brilliance shone in the twilight of classical Greece. Although primarily known for his work in mathematics, Theaetetus is also immortalised in philosophy, thanks to Plato. But don't worry, we'll focus on the maths, not the metaphysics. Settle in as we explore Theaetetus' geometric insights, his role in shaping mathematics, and his influence on those who came after him. But first, let me share with you another period of history. There was a time where your mobile phone was unable to send a photograph. Somehow, as a civilization, we survived, if not thrived. But through this time, I was driving my very first ice cream van. One day I was cruising along, happily distributing joy in conic sections, when my van decided it had had enough. One moment the engine was purring like a kitten, the next it was coughing, sputtering, and then I believe the technical term is raging like a much more angry kitten. I managed to roll it to the side of the road near a park, where instantly a line of children formed. This was unhelpful. Luckily for me, it scraped together enough cash to cover some emergency repairs. Now, I am not a car guy. My knowledge of engines starts and ends with, does it make a sound when you turn the key? But fortunately, or so I thought, I used to have a friend who was a mechanic. So I gave him a call, hoping for a quick diagnosis. "All right," he said, after I described the symptoms. "It's probably the resonator assembly." And yes, this is how he spoke. "Excellent," said I. "What's that?" "The thingy that connects the doohickey to the whatchamacallit." I blinked. The what?" "You know, the thingy, near the other thing. You're going to need to replace it." Now this was not helpful. "Alan, I'm standing here with the hood open. Could you give me a little more detail? What does it look like?" He sighed like I was being unreasonable. "All right, it's sort of round, like with a bit of metal sticking out of it. Might be greasy. You can't miss it." Armed with this absolutely useless description, I limped my van to the nearest auto parts yard. Now, if you've never been to one, let me set the scene. It's row upon row of abandoned, semi-dismantled vehicles, each one looking like it's hiding a family of squirrels. It's the kind of place that makes you wonder about all the lives these cars have lived, and how many bad drivers have bought them. Naturally, the gentleman that ran the establishment had no interest in helping me find a part, so he directed me towards a row of vans and told me to let them know if I want anything. This was a time before health and safety. I called my friend Alan back, phone balanced precariously between my ear and shoulder as I wandered through the maze of rusty metal. "Okay," I said, "I'm here. What am I looking for?" "It's a sort of round, sort of pipe-ish," he repeated, as if this was helpful information. "Well, there are a lot of round things, Alan. Can you be more specific?" Does it have wire sticking out of it?" I don't know. I'm looking at something round with 3 wires sticking out of it. Is that it?" Maybe. What colour are the wires?" I looked closer, brushing aside years' worth of grime. Red, green, and is that blue or black? It's hard to tell." Alan was silent for a moment, and then, "No, that's not it. Shouldn't have any wires." "Then why did—" "Okay, Alan, every single part here has wires sticking out of it. I found 5 round things so far, and none of them are exactly like you're describing." "Well, it's probably the one that looks like it's been used a lot." "They all look like they've been used a lot, Alan. It's a scrapyard." By this point, I was starting to question whether Alan had actually seen an engine before. I held up what I thought might be the right part and described it in excruciating detail. Size, shape, level of greasiness, everything. Alan paused and then said, "No, that's definitely not it." "Are you sure?" Well, where did you find it?" "In the engine area." Nah. You should be looking underneath the van." As I say, I used to have a friend who was a mechanic. This went on for the better part of an hour, me holding up random bits of machinery, Alan giving me increasingly vague guesses, and a scrapyard employee watching from a distance with the bemused expression of someone who'd seen it all. Finally, I grabbed a part that vaguely fit the description and said, "Alan, I'm buying this one, and if it's wrong, you owe me." When I got back home, I googled a diagram of the engine and discovered, of course, that the part Alan had described wasn't even on my van. Turns out he'd been picturing a completely different model. I called him back to confront him, and all he said was, "Well, could have worked." So why am I telling you this story? Well, it's because sometimes, without a clear system or the right vocabulary, things get messy fast. Even when you have a clear and precise word to use, like resonator assembly, unless everyone involved knows that word, knows what it means, then you have to clearly define it for someone new. It's like trying to fix an ice cream van when your friend keeps calling everything a thingy. You might think that my story is farcical and made up, although I swear by my ice cream van that it's true. But for a bit more thematically appropriate way to hammer home the point, let me read to you from a passage of the Republic. "Now for divine begettings there is a period comprehended by a perfect number, and for mortal by the first in which augmentations dominating and dominated, when they have attained to 3 distances and 4 limits, the assimilating and the dissimilating, the waxing and the waning, render all things conversible and commensurable with one another, whereof a basal 4/3 wedded to the pampered yields 2 harmonies at the 3rd augmentation, the one the product of equal factors taken 100 times, the other of equal length one way, but oblong, one dimension of 100 numbers determined by the rational diameters of the pempad lacking 1 in each case, or of the irrational lacking 2, the other dimension of 100 cubes of the triad. And this entire geometrical number is determinative of this thing of better and inferior births." Now, I'm sure we can all agree what Plato means by this entire geometrical number he speaks of. Well, it's 216 for obvious reasons, and this is now called Plato's number. Or is it 3,600? Or possibly it's 12,960,000. Actually, scholars don't entirely agree with what Plato was trying to say. Perhaps, at this point, it's time we turn to Theaetetus. Let's begin by placing Theaetetus in historical context. Born around 417 BCE in Athens, he lived during a turbulent period in Greek history. The Peloponnesian War, the rise of Macedon, and the eventual decline of Athens as a political power formed the backdrop to his life. Despite these challenges, Athens remained a vibrant hub of intellectual activity, home to the likes of Plato, Socrates, and other luminaries. Theaetetus was a student of Socrates, which secured his place in Plato's dialogues. Plato's dialogue, Theaetetus, portrays him as a young, promising thinker, grappling with deep philosophical questions about the nature of knowledge. However, our focus today is his mathematical legacy. Theaetetus also studied under Theodorus of Cyrene, a mathematician known for his work with irrational numbers, and he later influenced Euclid, whose Elements preserved much of Theaetetus's insights. To truly appreciate Theaetetus, we need to start with a problem as ancient as Pythagoras himself: irrational numbers. Imagine ancient mathematicians wrestling with the Pythagorean theorem. If the sides of a square measure 1 unit, the diagonal is the square of root 2. But, as the Pythagoreans discovered to their dismay, the square root of 2 is not a fraction. It's irrational, and the Greeks didn't yet have a robust framework for dealing with such numbers. It would be simple if we could say that it is an inherent property of triangles, that the length of the hypotenuse is never commensurable with the sides, that is, it can never be written as a ratio of integers with the sides. But this is too simple, because some hypotenuses are commensurable, and we have known about these Pythagorean triples for about a millennia before Pythagoras was born. If only there was a way of organising the body of knowledge. This is where Theaetetus comes in. Building on the work of Theodorus, he expanded the study of irrationals. Theodorus had proven the irrationality, or as he might call it, the incommensurability of certain square roots like the square root of 3 and the square root of 5, but he stopped at the square root of 17. Why? Well, historians speculate that his method, likely geometric, became too cumbersome beyond that point. We discussed this back in episode 8. Theaetetus, however, took a more general approach. He developed a systematic classification of irrational numbers, setting the tone for future mathematicians to construct specific definitions and clarifications for terms necessary for a broader understanding. Specifically, he recognized that square roots of non-square integers are a distinct category of numbers, what we might today call quadratic irrationals. For those who haven't studied maths formally, let's expand this. All quadratic irrationals are irrational, but not all irrationals are quadratic. To be a quadratic irrational, a number must be in the form of square root of n, where n is not itself a square. Alternatively, you could describe it as being the solution of the quadratic equation x squared equals n. Although, of course, remember that Theaetetus did not have access to this algebraic notation for equations. In the historical context, this would have been described as the side length of a square whose area is not equal to a square of integer side length. This description of a quadratic irrational suggests further descriptions. For instance, you might have a cubic irrational, which is a solution of the equation x cubed equals n, where n is not a cubed integer, for instance the cube root of 2. Indeed, we can extend this to algebraic numbers, which are the roots of polynomials with integer coefficients. We then have another class of irrational numbers that are not algebraic, that is, they can never be the roots of polynomials with integer coefficients. We might call these transcendental numbers. Some that you might be familiar with could be pi or e. Anyway, back to our story. Theaetetus' work was crucial for Euclid, who codified it in the Elements in Book 10, the longest and perhaps most intricate part of that monumental text. While Theaetetus didn't leave behind writings of his own, Euclid's work ensures that his contributions remain with us. Next, let's shift from numbers to shapes. Theaetetus is credited with a significant contributions to the theory of Platonic solids, those symmetrical, three-dimensional figures that fascinated the Greeks. There are exactly 5: the tetrahedron, the cube, or you may say hexahedron, the octahedron, dodecahedron, and icosahedron. So why only 5? Well, Theaetetus offered one of the earliest known systematic explanations. He worked out the mathematics of these solids, studying how their faces, edges, and vertices relate. His insights are embedded in Elements Book 13, where Euclid discusses their properties and proves their uniqueness. We can summarize it today. Theaetetus' reasoning is as elegant as it is precise. It starts with the defining characteristic of Platonic solids. They must be composed of congruent, regular polygons, meeting in identical ways at each vertex. This symmetry and regularity impose strict geometric constraints. First, consider the angles of regular polygons. For a shape to form a convex solid, meaning a three-dimensional figure with no inward curves, the sum of the angles at each vertex must be less than 360 degrees. Although, of course, that is a modern anachronism, as degrees wasn't part of the vocabulary back in Theaetetus' day. If the angles meeting at the vertex add up to 360 degrees or more, the shape would flatten out and fail to create a three-dimensional object. Now, let's examine the possibilities. The regular polygons available are the equilateral triangle, the square, and the pentagon. This is because the hexagon will meet with 3 hexagons around a point forming 360 degrees, which is now the upper limit of what we might consider. So that leaves us just with these 3 shapes, which each have interior angles that work within these limits. Equilateral triangles can meet in 3 ways, forming the tetrahedron with 3 triangles per vertex, the octahedron with 4 triangles per vertex, and the icosahedron with 5 triangles per vertex. Beyond this, if you were to meet 6 triangles at a vertex, it would once again add up to 360 degrees and not form a three-dimensional shape. The square will only work in one arrangement, 3 squares meeting at a vertex, which will form the cube. Again, if we had 4 squares at a vertex, this would hit 360 degrees as the upper limit and not form a 3-dimensional shape. Regular pentagons also allow for just one possibility, with 3 pentagons meeting at a vertex, and this forms the dodecahedron. And therefore, considering that there are only 3 shapes that can work with these restrictions, and exploring each of those 3 shapes exhaustively to see how they could be arranged, we have the conclusion that there are indeed only these 5 potential 3-dimensional solids that could be built. But Theaetetus didn't stop at cataloguing these shapes. He explored their geometric construction, paving the way for later mathematicians and philosophers to see these solids as more than just curiosities. Plato, for example, tied them to his cosmology, associating each solid with an element: earth, air, fire, and water, and the heavens. While Plato's metaphysical connections were speculative, the mathematical precision of Theaetetus's work was anything but. So you might be wondering, why did we discuss these so much last week in the episode on Plato? And why are they not called the Theaetetusian solids? Well, mainly because that is a mouthful to both say and spell, but also because these solids were introduced in Plato's work. Plato was the more popular influencer who ensured Theaetetus's work was made famous. And also, if we take away the solids from Plato, then there really is little reason to include him at all. Back in episode 1 on aims, I set out the scope and aims of this podcast. One of the first milestones was to work up to Euclid, as I assigned him the first mathematician with extant material, that is, a book that you can still go out and buy from a bookshop. Now it turns out this is only really partially true, as Plato's work does also still exist today. You can still go out and buy it, and he does discuss mathematical ideas, although arguably not his own, just the mathematics of other people. And it is also not true for another mathematician, Autolycus, who I haven't told you about yet, but we will talk about just before the episode on Euclid, who snuck in just under the radar, but is not significant enough to be a milestone in his own right. Another moment to reflect that not necessarily everything I say is technically true, but it does make a good story. And let's get back to that story. I want to address the crucial question: why does Theaetetus matter? After all, his name doesn't adorn treatises like Euclid's or Archimedes does. Yet his contributions form a bridge between earlier discoveries and later developments in Greek mathematics. Let's talk about one of Theaetetus's most enduring contributions to mathematics: his rigorous use of definitions. In Greek mathematics, precision in language wasn't just helpful, it was foundational. Theaetetus exemplified this approach, laying down a tradition of mathematical clarity that shaped the work of later thinkers, most notably Euclid. Theaetetus understood that mathematical progress depended on clear and unambiguous definitions. In his work, he approached mathematical objects not just as practical tools, but as abstract entities that needed to be formally described. This was crucial for ensuring that mathematicians could build on each other's work with consistency and precision. Take, for instance, his approach to regular solids. To describe and classify the Platonic solids, Theaetetus rigorously defined their key properties. They must be convex, composed of identical, regular, polygonal faces, have the same number of faces meeting at each vertex. These definitions weren't just descriptions, they became the basis of proving why only 5 such solids exist. Theaetetus's emphasis on formal definitions also influenced the organisation of Greek mathematics as a deductive science. This approach is evident in Euclid's Elements, which opens with carefully structured definitions, axioms, and postulates, before moving into proofs. While Euclid gets the credit for this structure, the roots of this methodology trace back to Theaetetus's intellectual rigour. Ultimately, Theaetetus's commitment to precision in defining mathematical objects wasn't just a technical detail, it was a philosophical stance. By insisting on clarity at the foundational level, he helped transform mathematics into a discipline where ideas could be explored abstractly and systematically. His legacy reminds us that every great mathematical theory begins with a clear definition. Theaetetus embodies the collaborative nature of mathematics. He built on the work of predecessors like Theodorus and Pythagoras, while influencing successors like Euclid. His story reminds us that mathematics is a collective endeavour, with each generation standing on the shoulders of the last. Before we conclude, let's take a brief detour into philosophy. Plato's Theaetetus is one of his most celebrated works, and it offers a fascinating portrait of the mathematician as a young man. The dialogue explores the nature of knowledge, with Socrates guiding Theaetetus through various definitions, only to dismantle them one by one. Why is this relevant? Because it reveals something profound about Theaetetus' character. Plato portrays him as humble, eager to learn, and unafraid to grapple with difficult problems, qualities that any mathematician would admire. The dialogue also serves as a testament to the intellectual synergy between mathematics and philosophy in ancient Greece. For Theaetetus, the pursuit of mathematical truth was inseparable from the pursuit of wisdom. Theaetetus died young, around 369 BCE, during a military campaign, but his mathematical legacy far outlived him. His work set the stage for Euclid's Elements, one of the most influential texts in history of mathematics. And today, Theaetetus' contributions remind us of the power of systematic thinking, whether classifying irrationals or studying Platonic solids. He approached problems with a clarity and rigour that continues to inspire. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and work of Theaetetus. If you enjoyed this episode of The Mathematicians Podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with fellow maths enthusiasts. Next time, we'll take another slice of a mathematical giant, Eudoxus. Tuning in next week would be a proportional response. Until then, goodbye! The music today is Danse Macabre Finale by MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes. Incommensurability.